To get set up, make sure you have your paper taped down onto a hard surface. Your artboard will work. This is just a little sheet of masonite that I use. It's small and light. And the photo I'm working from that I've emailed you guys is almost a square, so I cut a little bit off the edge of my watercolor paper. So make sure your paper is taped down to your surface, and you want the tape to be half on the paper and half on your board. So that way when you peel it off, you'll have a nice clean white edge around your painting. The materials you're going to need are your watercolor paper taped onto your board, your watercolor palette, and in the beginning of the semester, we only used a limited palette, just a certain number of colors. I'm okay, since you're working from home now, with you branching out and using more colors on your palette. So as you can see in watercolor, I work with a lot of different colors. I'll try to do most of my mixing just with your basic primaries, so that if you are still working with a limited palette, then the colors will match up. Make sure you have 2 jars of water, a clean one and a dirty one for rinsing out your brush. And you will need, of course, your watercolor brushes. I tend to use more than 2 or 3 brushes at a time, just because I like to have one on hand for blending. And then you'll need your sponge. Don't forget paper towels. I've got those over here. And then what I like to do is keep a little mister. This one is actually for watercolors, but just a little spray bottle will work. And when you open up your palette, everything has dried up. All the paints are dried. So I just give them a little mist with my mister, and that'll soften them up before I start working. I'm going to start by sketching my image lightly with pencil, and I'm going to find the part of my composition that hits the midpoint first. So this little mountain range is halfway up my paper, and it meets this one right here. And this assignment is more about the painting than the drawing. So obviously I want you to use your angles and negative space, midpoint of your paper to get things as accurate as possible, but I don't want you to spend too much time on the drawing. I want you to get some painting practice in. And then in this image that I chose, there are 2 or 3 very, very faint mountain ranges in the far background, and I'm going to leave those out because, again, we're just worried about 3 values for each area in this painting: light, medium, and dark. And those mountain ranges in the far back are so far away, we're not even going to worry about them. They just kind of blend in with the sky. And then with my clouds here, I'm going to sketch in just the biggest clouds. That one got too far down. Move that little guy up. And I don't want my sky to be too crowded, so I'm going to leave a few of these little tiny clouds out. And I need a little more space here. And then here's my foreground. So slight slope upwards. And then we've got the little hills right behind it. I have to be strategic with the areas that I paint next to each other because I don't want all the colors bleeding into one another. So I'm going to start with my mountain range that's furthest away, and I'm just going to mix up a nice cool blue. And make sure you have your test strip. And don't forget that your watercolor is going to dry a little bit lighter than the way you paint it. And I also keep a little squirt bottle with water so that I can lighten my color without going back into my jar. So I'll just brush this over my mountain. And I guess I do like doing a drip wash on larger areas. So I can just lift this at an angle and get a nice smooth wash going down that mountain range. Remember, for the drip wash, you want to have that bead of water, bead of paint going all the way across the bottom of your wash. Okay, so I have extra paint down here. I'm just gonna dry off my paintbrush and soak up the bottom there. It's okay if it runs into my other mountains for now because those are also gonna be blue. So while this dries, I'm gonna go up into my sky. And that's going to be a little bit of a warmer blue. So I'm going to take my ultramarine and mix it in with that cool cobalt that I was using. And this might be too saturated. It's not bad. That's a nice sky color. So now I'm going to go up to my sky and just do a wash around the clouds. So I'm making sure I have lots of paint in my brush. And my board is at, well, maybe a 15-degree angle right now, just enough to encourage that paint to go down. Okay, so I'm going to soften some of these paint edges here. Cut into this cloud a little bit more. And soak up the extra paint. Might make it a little wispier down here too. And put a little blue in here. Okay, that's still wet, so I don't want to paint next to it. I can go into this mountain here because they don't really touch. And that's going to be a darker blue than what's back here, and it's almost as warm as that sky color. I'm just going to add a little bit of phthalo blue to it, just to make it a little greener. Okay, so I'll paint this range here. And this image is a really great example of atmospheric perspective, which we talked about last week. So as the mountains move away from us, the viewer, they're going to get lighter and cooler, and they'll have softer edges. A little bit of this color right in here. Soaking up the extra paint at the bottom. And now I'm going to jump to the foreground. So I'm leaving space in between my drying paint. And for my foreground, I'm going to do wet into wet to start off with. So I'm going to paint the whole foreground kind of a bright yellow green. Maybe a little more yellow. And without having the green to start with, I would mix this color with lemon yellow and phthalo or cobalt blue. I think you guys have the phthalo. And I'm just going to paint this whole foreground with a little more water. And I don't have to worry about doing a nice drip wash because I'm going to mix other colors in there. It doesn't need to have a nice smooth texture. And I don't want to get my paper too saturated because then it'll start curling on me. I guess I do see this color. There's a little bit of land kind of going behind the trees there. So we can bring that up. And then while it's wet, I can add in, I see some patches of ochre. And they'll just kind of blend themselves. And so remember, you can use the point of your brush to get thinner strokes, and the side of your brush to get thicker strokes. It's kind of a muddy color down here, so I'll mix that ochre with the green. And then let's see if I can put some brighter yellow in while it's still wet. And the green's kind of overpowering the yellow there, so I can take a little corner of my tissue and just lift out where I'd like the yellow to go, and then paint it in. And because the flowers in the field are growing in horizontal patches, my strokes are going horizontally. So even in this foreground, we're going to have more saturated values in the front and less saturated values towards the back, as well as cooler colors as we move backwards. So I just mixed kind of like a seafoam green that's going to be pretty watery. Let's add more water. That should work. And I'm just going to brush that back here, cool it off a little bit. And then, how wet is this? I think I'm still gonna put, the shadows in while it is wet. We're still gonna do wet into wet. So I'm gonna grab a little bit of my dark greens, and if I were mixing these, I would take, I'll do it now. I'll take some ultramarine blue and some cadmium yellow. That's giving me a really nice dark foresty green. And I'm going to put in the harder edge first of, I guess they're little bushes, little plants out there. And then they're going to have a softer edge on the top. So this is where I would take another brush, dip it in the water, dab it on my sponge, so it's not too wet, but it's got a little moisture on it, and just soften the top edges of my bushes. So with watercolor, you actually don't want to blend too much. You want to just run your brush along it enough to soften it just a little bit, give it a soft edge. And there's some bushes in the front of the foreground. And I'm going to clean off my blending brush a little bit. And the bushes get a little more sparse over here. And then we've got some browns in the foreground. Oops. I'm just going to brush in a little bit of reddish brown and blend just a little bit. And then off in the distance, we're going to have tinier shapes. So I'm just going to take a little bit of my green. I added some extra water to it so it's lighter as it gets further away. And I'm just going to put little spots of green back here. And just soften them a little bit. And my paper's getting a little bumpy, so I'm going to blow dry it now. Let's continue putting the mountain ranges in. So I'm going to mix a blue right in between these two. I'm going to start with the cool. And that is too much blue. So we'll start a new pile over here. And add a little bit of warm. I'm trying to get it darker. It's not quite dark enough. Let's see if that works. There we go. So I'll wash that in. And then in the front here, I need my most saturated blue yet, and it's gonna be warmer. So I'm gonna get a lot of ultramarine, and let's test that. So that's too warm, so I'm gonna go a little bit cooler. A little bit darker. Let's try this, see what we get here. I think this will work for the base coat because we're going to add some trees on top of this. So I know this is pretty cool right now, but once we add the warmer trees on top, I think it'll balance out. So I'm just defining the top of the mountain range. And this is also an area, it's okay if I go back into it because we're gonna add trees on top for texture. So I'm just gonna blend right where this meets the grass. I was getting green everywhere, so I wiped off some of my palette just to get rid of the green that was spreading. So here is a nice warm blue. I'm going to slowly add some gray to it. And this should be a good gray for my clouds. Yeah, I like it. So here's my darker pile, and I'm going to add a little bit water over here to make a lighter one to start off with. So I'm going to find the shadow areas of my clouds and just brush in some of this gray. And I'm going to blend a little bit as I go. Give it a soft edge there. I'm gonna leave my whites white on the paper. A little extra paint there I'm gonna wipe up. So it's most efficient to lay all your shadows down first and then go through and blend them. And back here, I think I'm just gonna do a little haze. We were leaving those mountains out there, ones that were furthest back. So I'll just kind of blend that into a haze there. Same thing right around here. And then I feel like I want a brighter blue for my sky. I want it to contrast with my clouds a little bit more. So let's see what happens if I take some cool blue and add water to it. And since the clouds are going to have soft edges, it should be okay to brush this in while the clouds are still damp. I'm just going to brighten up my sky. It was a little too warm and the clouds were kind of fading into it. And I'm going to blend some of these edges as I go. And I'm just barely running my brush over those edges, not too much blending. Okay, I'm going to keep adding that cool blue. And then I'm going to go back in and put some darker shadows in my clouds. I'm going back to my cloud color. And we need a darker version. So I think that was the crimson, the ultramarine, and that gray that I had mixed. And that's a little purpley, but let's see what it looks like if I put it in the clouds. I'm gonna make it a little bit lighter. Let's give it a shot. So the shadows are going to be at the bottoms of the clouds, so that's where I'm focusing. And let's go a little bit darker. And there's a big shadow here. And let's put one right in here. And I'm going to suggest the bottoms of some clouds right in here. That part's not in the picture, but I just think it'll help. So it's assisting me right now that it's still a little damp in the cloud areas, and that's helping it blend very naturally on its own to a degree. A little bit there. Okay, and there's our clouds. I'm going to blow dry again so my paper doesn't bubble up too much. I'm going to mix a blue that's just slightly darker than what's there already. And I'm just going to brush in some planes that are catching shadow back there. So it's just adding a little more depth to the painting. And I'll blend just slightly. We want them to be fairly hard-edged. I'm just softening the edges a bit because they are so far in the background. We won't have the contrast that we would in the foreground. And then I do want to soften this edge right here a little bit. It is a hard edge because it's one mountain overlapping another, but because those two ranges are so far in the distance, it won't be so sharp. And I can do that with this edge as well. So I'm just doing that with a damp brush. And these are fading away, so I'm going to go a little bit darker. As they dry, they're getting a little bit too light. There we go. So for this range, same thing. We're going to get a slightly darker blue than what's there. And paint in some planar shapes. And then we'll move on to the next mountain, go a little bit darker. And I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine to the mixture. So this is my blending brush. I'm just dragging some of those mountain shapes up. And as this dries, I feel like I would like the base of that mountain to be just slightly darker. So I'm gonna go back to that area. Cool blue, a little bit darker, and just right in here, and add a little bit more. My blending brush picked up paint, so let me get all that out of there. And then finally we have this tree area up here. And I don't think anybody wants to paint 200 little trees. So what I would do for that area is take a little bit of green, and just suggest some texture back there with the green. Now, I don't think you have to paint every single little tree on there, just little textures. And they are in the distance, so we can blend those a little bit. Give them softer edges. So that'll just break up that solid blue in the mountain. I'm going to take a couple spots with really, really dark green. Add a little blue violet to it to make it darker and cooler. And then I can just add some darker spots in there for contrast. And this is my blending brush. And then I think I'll let the trees kind of fade off into the distance here. We'll create a focal point that's nearer to us, and then the trees are just going to be blurrier and lighter on this mountain here. And we'll do a couple on the top. Okay, and that's it.